In the mid-19th century, in the burgeoning American Republic, a man named Lysander Spooner embarked on a singular crusade. He was not a politician nor a general, but a legal theorist and entrepreneur. His battleground was the very concept of authority, and his first significant skirmish against an institution many considered sacrosanct, the United States Post Office. More than just a business venture, this was an act of political defiance, a direct assault on what he perceived as an illegitimate monopoly, a practical application of his deep-seated belief in natural rights and limited government. Candlelight flickers across stacks of books and legal papers. The air is thick with the scent of old paper and fresh ink, a testament to countless hours of study and relentless intellectual pursuit. Born in 1808 in Massachusetts, Lysander Spooner was a man of fierce independence and formidable intellect. His path to legal understanding was unconventional. He was largely self-taught. When he sought to practice law, the Massachusetts bar in 1833 required a 5-year apprenticeship for those without a college degree. Spooner, ever the challenger of arbitrary rules, refused to comply. He argued that this requirement was an unconstitutional restraint on the right to earn a living, a violation of fundamental liberty. His persistence and the undeniable merit of his legal arguments eventually forced the bar to relent, allowing him to practice without the mandated apprenticeship. This early victory solidified his belief in natural rights and the inherent illegitimacy of laws that infringed upon them, shaping his future battles against perceived governmental overreach and reinforcing his conviction that individuals possessed inherent rights that no government could justly abridge. His legal mind, sharp and unyielding, soon turned to the most pressing moral crisis of his time: slavery. In 1845, Spooner published the first edition of The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. This was not a moral plea, nor an emotional plea, but a meticulous, constructed legal argument. He contended that the Constitution, when interpreted according to its original public meaning, that is, how a reasonable person at the time of the ratification would have understood its words, did not sanction slavery. This was a radical departure from the views of many abolitionists. A crowded, dimly lit hall, the air is thick with anticipation. Frederick Douglass, 27, stands at a podium, holding a copy of Spooner's book. His voice echoes with conviction as he addresses the audience, his words carrying immense weight, challenging long-held assumptions. Douglass explained that for too long, many abolitionists have believed the Constitution was a pact with the devil, a document that enshrined human bondage, citing several clauses and the founding debates as evidence. He asserted that Lysander Spooner, with his rigorous legal mind, revealed a different truth. Spooner demonstrated that the words themselves, as understood by the public at the time of their writing, did not grant the power to enslave. Douglass emphasized Spooner's argument that if the law's words were ambiguous, with one meaning being just and another unjust, then the just interpretation must prevail. This, Spooner maintained, was a principle of natural law, a higher law that superseded mere legislative will. The Constitution, he asserted, contained no explicit mention of slavery. The passages supposedly referring to it, such as persons held to service or labor, or the migration or importation of such persons, used euphemisms. Spooner insisted that these euphemisms must be read in their innocent sense, not in a way that violated fundamental human rights. He argued that slavery so severely violated natural law and human dignity that any law upholding it would have to state it unambiguously, if there were any conceivable interpretation that did not uphold such a repugnant institution. Therefore, vague or ambiguous constitutional clauses should be read in favor of liberty, not slavery. A murmuring of agreement rippled through the audience, though a few exchanged skeptical glances, still grappling with this novel interpretation that challenged their deeply ingrained beliefs. Spooner's argument was a direct challenge to the prevailing Garrisonian view, which condemned the Constitution as inherently pro-slavery, urging its outright rejection. Frederick Douglass, a prominent abolitionist who once shared Garrison's stance, was swayed by Spooner's reasoning. The book became influential, spreading like wildfire among those seeking a legal basis for abolition, providing a powerful intellectual weapon in the fight against human bondage. Though many abolitionists continued to disagree with Spooner's constitutional optimism, U.S. Representative from North Carolina, Thomas Clingman, stands before his peers. He holds a copy of Spooner's book, tapping it with his finger, his expression one of deep disapproval, clearly perturbed by its growing influence. Clingman expressed his concern that the unconstitutionality of slavery by Spooner had gained an alarming popularity. He conceded its novelty accounted for its rapid spread, but warned that its interpretive methodology, which claimed to find anti-slavery meaning where none was intended, was dangerous. Clingman even suggested that by such reasoning, one might prove that a woman could be president of the United States, a notion that elicited laughter from some members and palpable concern from others, highlighting the perceived radicalism of Spooner's approach and its potential to upend established order. Clingman's scorn, however, inadvertently highlighted the book's impact. Spooner's ideas resonated even among those who vehemently disagreed with his conclusions. His insistence on original public meaning over the unexpressed intentions of the framers, and his clear statement rule for ambiguous laws were sophisticated legal concepts. They challenged the very foundation of how law was meant to be understood and applied. Spooner stands by a window, looking out at the street. He holds a letter or response to a legal challenge. While his work on slavery gained him a renown, Spooner's most audacious act of practical anarchism began earlier, in 1844, with the establishment of the American Letter Mail Company. The United States Post Office held a government-granted monopoly, a system Spooner viewed as an unjust infringement on individual liberty and free enterprise. He believed that if the government could monopolize the mail, it could, by extension, monopolize any industry, thereby stifling innovation and individual initiative. He firmly believed that monopolies, whether granted by government or arising through private collusion, had no legitimate justification in mail service or any other economic activity. Spooner's company offered a direct challenge to the established order. He argued that the Constitution did not explicitly grant Congress the power to create a postal monopoly, only establish a post office and post roads. This, he contended, meant Congress could only establish a postal system, but not prohibit private competition. He saw the government's monopoly as an unconstitutional overreach. Spooner's company charged 6.25 cents per half-ounce letter for distances up to 3,000 miles, significantly less than the government's 12.5 to 25 cents. He even offered local city delivery for a mere penny. His network expanded rapidly, establishing routes between major cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The public, eager for cheaper and more efficient service, embraced his initiative, demonstrating a clear preference for his private alternative and putting immense pressure on the federal system. His service was not only cheaper but also more efficient, a stark contrast to the often slow and inexpensive government mail. The success of Spooner's venture did not go unnoticed by the federal government. They saw it as a direct threat to their authority and revenue. Legal actions were swiftly initiated. The federal government sued him, threatened with legal action, and Spooner and his associates faced numerous lawsuits, crippling fines, and even arrests. The government deployed its full legal and coercive power to suppress his operation, determined to enforce its legal monopoly on mail delivery. Prosecutors argued that Spooner's actions constituted a direct violation of federal law, an affront to the authority of the United States. He emphasized that the post office was a vital public service, a cornerstone of national unity and communication, implying that any challenge to it was an attack on the nation itself. Spooner, calmly but firmly, countered that the government's claim of monopoly was without constitutional basis. He challenged the prosecutor to identify where in the Constitution the power was granted to Congress to prohibit individuals from carrying letters for hire. He asserted that the power to establish the post office was not the power to forbid all others from engaging in the same enterprise, declaring that monopoly was a creature of arbitrary power, not of natural right, and thus illegitimate. The judge listened, impassive, ultimately siding with the established interpretation of federal power, upholding the government's claim to exclusive control. Spooner argued his case with characteristic legal precision, citing constitutional principles and natural law, but the court, bound by existing interpretations of federal power and the perceived necessity of governmental monopoly, consistently ruled against him. Despite the legal setbacks, his actions had a profound effect. The very existence of his private mail service and its clear superiority in terms of cost and efficiency exposed the inherent inefficiencies and high costs of the government monopoly, creating a public demand for reform. The pressure mounted on Congress in 1851, faced with relentless legal harassment and the sheer force of federal power, Spooner was compelled to cease operations of the American Letter Mail Company. However, his efforts were not in vain. The government, recognizing the public outcry and the undeniable efficiency demonstrated by Spooner, drastically reduced its own postage rates that very year. Spooner himself later claimed credit for the reduction, arguing, with considerable justification, that his competition had forced the government's hand, proving the benefit of free market principles even in the face of state monopoly. To this day, delivering first-class mail remains illegal for private carriers in the United States, a lasting legacy of the government's successful suppression of Spooner's challenge. The experience with the post office, coupled with the escalating tension leading to the Civil War and its aftermath, deepened Spooner's philosophical anarchism. He had initially believed the Constitution could be interpreted as a bulwark against injustice, particularly slavery. But the failure of the legal system to consistently uphold natural rights, even when he believed the text supported it, led him to a radical conclusion: that the Constitution itself lacked true authority. This shift was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual hardening of his convictions as he observed the state's consistent overreach and its failure to protect the very liberties it claimed to uphold. Spooner's pamphlet, No Treason, published in 1870, articulated his argument that the Constitution possessed no inherent authority or obligation. He asserted that its only potential for authority lay in its function as a contract between individuals, and it did not even claim to be a contract among living persons. He reasoned that those who supposedly consented to it, the framers and early ratifiers, were long dead. He believed that the current generation, had never even given their explicit consent to be governed by this document. He argued that acts like voting or paying taxes were not true acts of consent, but often acts of submission, performed out of necessity or fear of state coercion, rather than genuine agreement. For Spooner, a government that claimed authority without the explicit ongoing consent of each individual it governed was fundamentally illegitimate, no matter how benevolent it claimed to act, or how many generations had passed since its supposed inception. This later work, No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, marked a significant evolution in his thought. He contended that if a government's power were truly derived from the consent of the governed, and the consent was never genuinely given by the current generation, then the government lacked legitimate authority. He famously drew a comparison between the government and a highwayman. Both, he argued, demand money under threat. However, the highwayman, Spooner noted, at least did not pretend to be a protector. Nor did he claim a rightful claim to your money. Nor did he brand you a traitor if you resisted. The highwayman, Spooner argued, was at least honest enough about his intentions. Unlike a government that cloaked its coercion in the guise of legitimacy and public benefit. This comparison was designed to strip away the veneer of moral authority that governments often claim, exposing their actions as mere exercises of power and challenging citizens to recognize the true nature of their relationship with the state. Spooner's intellectual journey led him to a profound understanding of constitutional legitimacy. He believed that a constitution could not be legitimate if it bound those who governed, ensuring that the laws they imposed on the non-consenting public were consistent with natural justice and natural rights. The oath taken by office holders, Spooner suggested, was their explicit act of consent. For the citizenry, the obligation to obey laws stemmed not from their consent to the government itself, but from the laws themselves being just and protective of rights, regardless of whether they had personally agreed to the governmental structure. This distinction between the interpretation of the law's meaning and its construction or application became central to understanding Spooner's nuanced position. He believed that the text of the Constitution, properly interpreted according to its original public meaning and with a presumption towards justice, could be a powerful tool for liberty. But if that text was consistently misapplied, or if the procedures it established failed to secure justice and protect individual rights, then its utility and ultimately its legitimacy evaporated. Spooner's later work reflected his growing conviction that the American government, in practice, had indeed failed this test, leading him to advocate for a more radical form of individual sovereignty in a society built on voluntary cooperation rather than coercion. Spooner's commitment to justice expanded beyond legal theory or economic critique. His abolitionist fervor was so profound that in 1859, following John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Spooner even attempted to organize a daring plot to kidnap the governor of Virginia. The plan was to hold the governor hostage to secure the release of John Brown, the abolitionist, from prison. This audacious scheme, though ultimately unsuccessful and never carried out, underscored his willingness to pursue radical means for what he considered a just cause, demonstrating his belief that unjust laws and institutions warranted direct, even revolutionary action. A year earlier, Spooner had even written a broadside urging slave insurrections, a fiery call to arms against the institution of slavery. However, John Brown himself, aware of his own impending plans, discouraged Spooner from publishing it, fearing it might reveal Brown's intentions prematurely. This interaction highlights Spooner's deep involvement in the abolitionist movement and his willingness to consider extreme measures for the cause of liberty. His later years saw him delve deeply into economic theory, meticulously critiquing the existing distribution of wealth. He argued that the vast inequalities were not the normal outcomes of free exchange or superior ability, but rather a direct result of arbitrary and unjust legislative enactments. He contended that monopolies, even those in finance and land, were not natural market phenomena, but were created and maintained by state power and legal privilege. He championed the right of laborers and believed in a society where property rights were justly acquired through individual labor and innovation, not through theft, conquest, or state-granted monopolies. His vision was one of a truly free market, unburdened by government interference, which he believed would lead to more equitable and prosperous society for all. Spooner's ideas of class conflict, property, and the very nature of law itself continue to challenge contemporary thought, offering perspectives often overlooked in mainstream discourse. He's recognized as a pioneer of what some modern scholars now call free market anti-capitalism, arguing that true free markets, unburdened by state intervention and privilege, would lead to a more equitable distribution of wealth, rather than the concentrations seen by state-supported capitalism. He even held controversial views on intellectual property. Spooner's philosophical stance was that individual liberty and natural rights form the supreme authority, a moral bedrock. If the Constitution or any legal system aligned with natural law, if it did not, it was merely an exercise of power, not legitimate authority. His engagement with the Constitution, particularly in his early works, was an attempt to hold the government to its own professed standards, to expose the gap between its claim of legitimacy and its actual practices, ultimately pushing for a government that truly served liberty and justice for all individuals. Lysander Spooner died in 1877, a largely forgotten figure in his final years. His radical ideas often dismissed by his contemporaries. Yet his intellectual legacy would endure, resurfacing in later generations of thought. His unwavering commitment to individual liberty, his relentless questioning of authority, and his profound insights into constitutional interpretation continue to resonate with those who seek a deeper understanding of freedom and justice. From challenging the postal monopoly and forcing government reform to arguing against the legality of slavery, Spooner's life was a testament to the power of independent thought and the persistent pursuit of justice, even when it meant standing alone against the prevailing current of his time. He reminds us that the pursuit of liberty is not always found in grand political movements or popular consensus, but often in the quiet, persistent defiance of a single, unyielding mind, whose ideas, though initially radical, can ultimately reshape the landscape of thought and inspire future generations to question established power and strive for a more just and free society.